Welcome. We're glad you could join us today to learn about the Lake States Habitat Conservation Plan. This presentation is a result of the collaboration between Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin Departments of Natural Resources. A team of wildlife biologists and forest managers from each state make up the steering committee and are driving the Lake States HCP process. Today we'll begin by explaining foundational information about habitat conservation plans and associated incidental take permits. We'll discuss the background and importance of the Lake States HCP, and we'll spend time explaining the key elements in each chapter of the plan. At the end of this presentation, we'll explain ways you can participate and stay engaged. Your input is an essential part of this process. We want this plan to be a valuable tool for all of us. Incidental take permits authorize unintentional take, harm, or death of federally listed species. The permit is issued by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service after the review of a submitted application package. A habitat conservation plan is a required part of a permit application. The plan details activities and lands in which incidental take will occur, estimates potential impacts to species, and explains how those impacts will be mitigated. An incidental take permit allows for regulatory certainty while permittees adhere to the details of the habitat conservation plan. The overarching goal of the Lake States HCP is to provide a long-term strategy for saving imperiled forest bats while carrying out forest management activities. Although the Lake States HCP is by definition a habitat plan, the conservation strategy is more about addressing the take than conserving habitat. Bat populations are declining because of white-nose syndrome and are not habitat limited. For these reasons, we are concerned with limiting impacts to bats during forest management activities. With this plan, a permit would allow enrolled forest land owners to conduct forest management activities, such as timber harvesting, road development, or prescribed burning in habitat for endangered bats. Forest land owners, public or private, would have the opportunity to enroll under the permit and have their woodlands covered by the provisions of the HCP. This process is really about risk management. Plan enrollees will maintain regulatory compliance despite potential endangered species status changes. If a species becomes endangered, enrolled landowners will be able to continue forest management activities as described in the HCP. Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan DNRs are working together to develop this HCP because forest bat populations are rapidly declining due to white-nose syndrome. One or more species may soon be reclassified as endangered, and this may affect the regulation of forest management operations. The Lake States HCP is a voluntary process and just one way to continue forest management activities in endangered bat habitat. Landowners may also work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to develop their own HCP if desired. Bats are important to the ecosystem. A single bat can consume hundreds of insects in a single night, reducing the need for agricultural pesticides and decreasing mosquito populations. Our non-migratory cave bats are imperiled. White-nose syndrome is decimating bat populations as the disease moves west across the landscape. Because of the devastating effects of WNS, we need to put greater emphasis on maintaining forest bat habitat. We share supporting missions to conduct sustainable forestry for the purpose of promoting wildlife, enhancing and maintaining forest health, generating revenue, supporting local communities, and providing recreational opportunities. All bat species considered in the HCP make extensive use of forests for maternity colonies, roosting, breeding, and foraging. Therefore, our forest management practices have the potential to impact and benefit bat species of concern. Our 3 states are working together because we share a unique forest ecosystem that provides habitat to bats and other wildlife. By working together, we can approach forest management for bats with consistency, and this makes implementation of the plan more convenient for all involved. We are striving for efficiency by combining our resources and working together. Transitioning to the key elements of the plan, in this webinar we'll spend time explaining the first 3 chapters of the HCP in detail. We will also provide a high-level overview of the remaining chapters. However, these later topics will be covered in detail, especially chapters 4 and 5, during in-person workshops next year. The species addressed in this plan are those that are most susceptible to white nose syndrome. These bats hibernate in caves where the disease-causing fungus has been detected, and populations have been declining throughout their range. Other federally listed species are not being covered in this HCP because either they aren't found in forest lands, insufficient data exist to cover the species, forestry activities avoid take, or species will be addressed in a separate compliance process. Indiana bat is federally listed as endangered and occurs in Michigan. It is not known to occur in Minnesota or Wisconsin, where the species hasn't been documented in nearly 50 years. Northern long-eared bat is federally listed as threatened and occurs in all 3 states. Little brown bat is under status review by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with the potential to become federally listed after the review concludes in 2023. Tricolored bat has been petitioned for listing, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is in the process of reviewing the petition. The HCP addresses all non-federal areas where forest management actions, including where conservation actions, mitigation, and monitoring will take place. Federally owned lands are not eligible for this HCP because lands supporting endangered species are treated differently under the Endangered Species Act. Forest management activities on these lands are eligible for cover under this HCP. However, participation is voluntary, and forest landowners may choose not to opt in. Landowners may manage risk in other ways, like working with the Fish and Wildlife Service to develop their own HCP. We measured land ownership patterns across Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin to determine how much land is eligible. Information on land ownership was obtained using the Forest Inventory and Analysis National Program, developed and maintained by the U.S. Forest Service. Of the almost 55 million acres of forest land in the 3 states, nearly half is owned by private, non-corporate entities. About 10% of forest land is owned by private corporations. State lands make up nearly 17%. and county and municipal governments own about 10%. Federal ownership makes up the remaining 14% of forest land. In summary, roughly 86%, or 47 million acres of forest land in the 3 states, is eligible in this HCP. The Lake States HCP is designed to address impacts to bats from all operational activities associated with timber harvest on HCP lands. This includes road and trail construction, maintenance and use, prescribed fire, and conservation strategy implementation. Data on eligible activities were provided by the state DNRs, including information about forest treatment types and acreages. Other forestry and prescribed burn acreages and road mileage were obtained through publicly available databases and scientific literature. In later chapters of the plan, eligible activities will be measured using these data and then used to estimate impacts to bat species. Harvest practices can become complex and result in different effects on bats. To address harvest practices in the context of their ecological effects on bats, we categorized forest practices by general harvest types, final harvest, and partial harvest. Final harvest practices like clear cuts, shelter wood removal harvest, and seed tree harvest have the greatest potential to directly affect bat habitat. These practices remove all or most of the canopy of trees that serve as potential roost trees from a stand. Partial harvest practices, including shelter wood preparatory cuts, commercial thinning, and intermediate treatments like group or single tree selection, have a lower potential to affect bats because they only remove some of the potential roost trees from a stand while retaining others. In later stages of the HCP, we will estimate the impact on bats due to these timber harvest practices. This estimate will help us determine the conservation actions needed to offset impacts. Management of forest land requires the construction, maintenance, and use of roads and trails on forest lands. This includes supporting activities like use of heavy equipment, removal of woody vegetation, installing rock, repaving, and improving or installing culverts. All impacts to bats due to roads and trails used for forestry purposes are addressed in this HCP. The HCP also addresses take associated with public use on DNR lands to encourage continual access to lands open to the general public. In later stages of the HCP, we will estimate the impact on bats due to roads and trails. We broadly categorized roads and trails to help model impacts. Categories include drivable roads, backcountry roads, and non-motorized trails. Prescribed fire is an important management tool, and the HCP addresses impacts to bats associated with burn activities for the purpose of fuel reduction, vegetation management, and invasive species control. The creation and maintenance of fire breaks is also covered under this plan. The HCP is intended to be beneficial for bat species. However, some conservation activities, like habitat restoration, may result in small or temporary adverse effects on bats. Therefore, the HCP must also cover the inherent impacts associated with the plan. plan implementation activities include habitat management practices such as planting and monitoring activities such as bat surveys requiring capture and handling of individuals. The state DNRs have discussed covered activities in depth. Here are examples of activities that will not be covered by this HCP. These activities are not appropriate for cover under this plan for reasons such as lack of information, existing permits, permits obtained under a separate program, or the risk that the project or activity is incompatible with the conservation strategy of this plan. Other activities that result in take should be addressed using a compliance process other than the Lake States HCP. All covered species use forests for roosting and foraging, but the intensity of use varies among forest types. In addition, bats use forests in different ways at different times of the year. To determine estimated take of bats on HCP lands, we needed to understand the environmental characteristics of eligible lands and where bats are distributed on the landscape. We used pre-WNS bat population occupancy and distribution data obtained from scientific databases and experts to create a distribution model for each bat species in the winter, summer, fall, and spring. We also used multiple data sets and input from experts to define and map land cover types and identify their value as bat habitat. Collectively, these data describe where and how many bats are on the landscape. This provides baseline information that will inform analysis of potential impacts and the resulting take estimate, which is currently in progress. The effects of threats like white nose syndrome and wind energy affect bat populations and distribution, but are not incorporated as part of the baseline. The cumulative effects of these threats will be analyzed later in the process. To this point, we've discussed the first 3 chapters of the HCP in detail. We'll continue with an overview of what's to come in the remaining chapters. However, the steering committee is currently having initial discussions about this content, and will be reaching out to engage stakeholders on this topic later in the process. As the HCP process continues, we will estimate potential impacts to bats due to covered activities on eligible lands. Ultimately, potential effects to HCP bat species will be authorized under an incidental take permit. Take assessments evaluate bat mortality, bat disturbance, and impacts to habitat. Based on what we know about the impacts of covered activities on HCP lands, and based on what we know about bat distribution, we will produce an estimate of the number of acres and number of bats impacted as a result of this HCP. As we continue through this process, we will develop a conservation strategy to avoid, minimize, and offset impacts to HCP bat species. The conservation strategy details methods and practices that must be followed to remain in compliance with the HCP and associated permit. The conservation strategy will include new and current practices that avoid and limit impacts to bats. The strategy will also describe mitigation measures that will offset any impacts that can't be minimized or avoided. In addition, the strategy will include a guide to monitoring HCP compliance and effectiveness during the implementation phase of the HCP. The conservation strategy is the keystone of the Lake States HCP. Forest management on DNR lands will comply with the conservation measures identified in this process. In addition, participating landowners must agree to implement conservation measures to obtain cover under this process. Therefore, it's essential to get input from forest landowners, forest managers, conservation groups, and other stakeholders. With your help, we will be able to complete a useful and effective plan. We are still having initial discussions on the details of plan implementation. However, we are planning on a 50-year permit term. We are also fairly certain that each state DNR will be issued a separate permit and will then authorize non-federal landowners through a voluntary Certificate of Inclusion process. Details on the permitting process are still being discussed, and stakeholders will have the opportunity to provide input in the future. In this chapter, we will also address assurances. These assurances are called no surprises assurances, and essentially mean that a deal is a deal. As long as the permittee is properly implementing the HCP, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will not impose additional requirements or restrictions. The services will honor these assurances as long as a permittee is implementing the requirements of the HCP permit and other associated documents in good faith, and their permitted activities will not jeopardize the species. Funding for HCP implementation must be guaranteed. Landowners enrolled in the plan would share the cost of plan implementation, and we will consider options for funding mechanisms later in this process. Finally, we will describe any possible alternatives to take considered during the HCP process and why we decided not to adopt those alternatives. This could include alternative practices to avoid or minimize impacts to species or alternative mitigation options. Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin have agreed that each DNR will be responsible for engaging stakeholders within each state. This means that although the timing of engagement and the information shared in each state will be consistent, the process for sharing information and collecting feedback from stakeholders will vary by each DNR. Each DNR hosts websites that inform interested persons of engagement opportunities in their state. In addition, each website hosts a GovDelivery email service that sends updates to subscribers. Each DNR will receive and compile feedback from stakeholders and work with each other and the HCP consultant to incorporate feedback in the HCP. The 3 state DNRs will be hosting a live webinar to answer your questions later this year. You can also submit questions ahead of time by emailing them to the email address provided on your state's website. Thank you for your time. We look forward to working with you while we continue the HCP process.